The morning sun glowed over Los Angeles, casting golden light on the city's bustling streets. A man, dressed in a simple black leather jacket and faded jeans, walked with quiet confidence, blending into the crowd despite being one of the most recognized faces in Hollywood. Keanu Reeves never sought attention, never demanded the spotlight. Today was no different. His destination? A well-known luxury car dealership, famous for its exclusivity, its high-end clientele, and its reputation for treating only the wealthiest with respect. But for Keanu, it wasn't about status. It was about finding something meaningful. He had spent months searching for the perfect car, not for himself, but for a cause close to his heart. As he stepped through the dealership's gleaming glass doors, the scent of polished leather and new car interiors filled the air. The showroom sparkled under bright white lights, displaying sleek, high-performance cars worth more than most people's homes. Keanu's eyes locked onto a rare vintage model at the back of the room. Something about its design, its history, drew him in. He took a step forward, but almost instantly, the atmosphere shifted. The employees, dressed in sharp suits and designer watches, barely acknowledged him. Whispers floated through the air. Does he even know where he is? He doesn't look like a serious buyer. Keanu ignored the murmurs. He had dealt with judgment before. Instead, he focused on the car that had captured his attention. It was a masterpiece. Its curves, its craftsmanship, its untold stories waiting to be revived. He approached a salesman who stood near the vehicle, lazily scrolling through his phone. "Excuse me," Keanu said politely. "Could you tell me more about this model?" The salesman barely glanced up, sighing as if interrupted from something far more important. "Hang on," he muttered. "I'll get someone." Without another word, he walked away, leaving Keanu standing alone. A few feet away, the dealership's manager, Richard, had been watching. A man of impeccable suits, sharp features, and an even sharper attitude, he prided himself on knowing his clientele before they even spoke. And to him, Keanu looked like nothing more than a waste of time. Richard smirked, adjusting the cuff of his designer blazer before making his way toward the customer, who had no business being here. He had no idea who he was about to insult. Keanu stood beside the vintage car, his fingers grazing the smooth surface as he admired its design. He wasn't in a rush. He had always believed that the right things take time. But in this dealership, patience wasn't a luxury they offered to just anyone. A sharp click of polished shoes against the showroom floor announced the arrival of Richard, the dealership manager. He approached with the practiced confidence of a man who judged people at a glance and considered himself always right. Richard stopped a few steps away, arms crossed, a smirk barely concealed on his lips. His gaze swept over Keanu's faded jeans, worn boots, and simple leather jacket before flicking back up to meet his eyes. "This model," Richard began, his voice smooth but condescending, "is highly exclusive. Not just anyone can buy it." Keanu turned to him, his expression calm, unaffected. "That's exactly why I'm interested," he said, his voice steady. Richard let out a short, amused breath, as if indulging a child who had wandered into a world meant for adults. "I don't think you understand," he continued, tilting his head slightly. "This car costs more than most houses in Beverly Hills. It's not just about money. It's about status, prestige." His eyes flickered over Keanu's outfit once more. "And with all due respect, you don't exactly fit the profile." Keanu's gaze didn't waver. He had seen this kind of arrogance before, the type of man who thought wealth defined worth. "Profile?" Keanu repeated, his voice neutral. Richard gave a small shrug, a smirk playing on his lips. "Our clientele are seasoned collectors, elite businessmen, people who appreciate what they're buying." He leaned slightly closer, lowering his voice. "Not dreamers looking for a joyride." A faint murmur passed through the showroom. A few employees had stopped pretending to work, their eyes discreetly watching the exchange. Some customers, dressed in designer suits and jewelry, glanced over, curiosity flickering in their expressions. Keanu stayed silent for a moment, letting Richard's words hang in the air. Then, finally, he spoke. his tone calm, almost amused. "Curious," he said. "You talk about exclusivity, but real luxury is treating people with respect. Maybe you should try that sometime." Richard's smirk faltered, his posture stiffened. For the first time, it seemed like he had underestimated the man standing in front of him, but instead of backing down, his pride kicked in. His jaw tightened, and with an exaggerated motion he took a step closer, invading Keanu's space. "Listen," he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper, laced with quiet hostility. "People like you come in all the time. You look around, maybe take a selfie next to a Ferrari, and then you leave without spending a dime." Keanu didn't flinch. He just tilted his head slightly, studying Richard with that same unshaken calmness. "And what if I'm not here to dream?" Keanu asked simply. Richard let out a short, sharp laugh, shaking his head. "Then you're in the wrong place. Because this dealership, it's for people who have something to prove. And from where I'm standing..." He gestured toward Keanu dismissively. "You don't look like you have either." A heavy silence fell between them. The quiet tension in the room grew thick enough to cut. Keanu exhaled slowly, his lips pressing together in a small, knowing smile. This was going to be interesting. Richard's smirk widened as if he had just won some unspoken battle. The confidence in his stance, the way he folded his arms, everything about him screamed superiority. But what he failed to realize was that Keanu had dealt with men like him before. The showroom had fallen almost silent now. Employees exchanged glances, a few discreetly inching closer, sensing that something was about to unfold. Even the customers, who had once been absorbed in their own conversations, now stole curious glances toward the confrontation. Keanu remained steady, his fingers casually brushing against the vintage car he had come to see. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't argue. Instead, he spoke with the same calm certainty that had disarmed so many before. "You seem very sure of yourself," Keanu said, his voice smooth, almost amused. "But let me ask you something. How many times have you been wrong?" Richard's smirk twitched slightly, but he recovered quickly. "Not once," he said with a confidence that felt rehearsed. "I know the kind of people who walk through these doors, and I know when someone's wasting my time." Keanu gave a small nod, as if considering his words. Then, with deliberate slowness, he reached into his jacket pocket. Richard's posture stiffened. For a split second, he looked like a man bracing himself for something unexpected. Instead, Keanu simply pulled out his wallet. He opened it with a flick of his fingers, revealing something small, something so subtle yet so powerful that the entire dynamic shifted in an instant. A black metal card. The kind of card that didn't have a credit limit, the kind that was only handed out to the wealthiest individuals in the world, the kind Richard had probably dreamed of holding himself. The smirk vanished from Richard's face. Keanu watched as the blood drained from the manager's expression, his once arrogant confidence now teetering on the edge of panic. "You were saying?" Keanu asked, raising an eyebrow. Richard blinked rapidly, his mouth opening slightly, as if searching for words. He had spent the last few minutes trying to belittle this man, push him out of the dealership, only to realize he had just insulted someone who could probably buy the entire building if he wanted to. A few employees exchanged quiet gasps. One even nudged a colleague as if to say, "Do you see what's happening?" Richard's lips parted, his voice barely above a whisper. But Keanu cut him off with a slight shake of his head. "No need," he said simply, slipping the card back into his wallet. "I've already learned everything I need to know." And with that, he turned, walking away from the car he had once admired. The moment was so effortless, so controlled, that it infuriated Richard. He had been humiliated without a single raised voice, without a single insult thrown back at him. His jaw clenched. His pride screamed for retaliation. And then, in a moment of pure desperation, Richard did the unthinkable. He took a step forward and shoved Keanu Reeves. A collective gasp spread through the showroom. A few people visibly recoiled, unable to believe what they had just witnessed. Keanu stumbled back a step, but his reaction wasn't what Richard expected. There was no anger, no shock, no retaliation. Instead, Keanu just looked at him. a slow, piercing stare that seemed to strip away every layer of Richard's arrogance in an instant. And in that moment, Richard realized something horrifying. He had just made the biggest mistake of his life. The room was dead silent. The shove wasn't hard enough to knock Keanu down, but it was enough to make every single person in the showroom freeze. Employees, customers, everyone stood in stunned disbelief. It wasn't just about who had been pushed, but what it represented. A luxury car dealership manager, in his arrogance and desperation, had just laid hands on Keanu Reeves. Richard's breath was unsteady. He hadn't planned to push him. It was a reflex, a knee-jerk reaction to feeling powerless. But now, as he stood there, his chest rising and falling with frustration, he saw the slow shift in the atmosphere. Keanu hadn't reacted with anger. He hadn't pushed back. He didn't need to. He just stood there, his gaze locked on Richard, a look so calm yet powerful that it sent a chill down the manager's spine. The employees who had once whispered about Keanu now looked at Richard with uncertainty, even discomfort. Some exchanged uneasy glances, others subtly stepped back, as if distancing themselves from what they now realized was a disaster unfolding. A young salesman near the reception desk swallowed hard, his fingers hovering over his phone. Should he record this? A middle-aged woman in a designer dress whispered to her husband, "Did that guy just assault Keanu Reeves?" The silence stretched on, suffocating until finally Keanu spoke. "That was unnecessary," he said, his voice steady. Richard blinked, his face still red with anger, but now mixed with something else. Fear. Richard stammered, but Keanu didn't let him finish. "I get it," Keanu continued, his voice soft but deliberate. "You think status is what makes a person worthy of respect. You think power comes from money." He shook his head slightly. "But the way you just reacted, that didn't come from power. It came from fear." Richard flinched, as if he had just been punched himself. For the first time he saw it, the way everyone was looking at him now. Not with admiration, not with respect, but with shame. Keanu exhaled, adjusting his leather jacket, completely in control. "You just tried to prove you were more important than me," he said, his voice dropping slightly. "And now, all you've proven is who you really are." A hush spread through the showroom. No one moved, no one spoke. And then, a slow, deliberate clap. One employee, a young man standing near the finance desk, brought his hands together once, then again. And suddenly, another person joined in, and another. Within seconds, the showroom was filled with applause. Not for Richard, for Keanu. The sound of applause echoed through the showroom, growing louder with each passing second. Employees, customers, people who had once ignored Keanu or whispered about him, were now clapping for him. Richard stood frozen, his jaw tightening, his hands clenched at his sides. His power, his authority, his arrogance. All of it had just collapsed in front of an audience. Keanu didn't smile. He didn't gloat. He simply stood there, his expression unreadable, as if he had seen this all before. Because in a way, he had. Then, without another word, he turned toward the exit. The applause continued as he walked, the claps feeling less like celebration and more like vindication. Each step he took made Richard feel smaller, weaker. He wanted to stop him, say something, fix this. But how do you undo a mistake like this? As Keanu neared the glass doors, a voice broke through the clapping. "Mr. Reeves, wait!" Keanu paused, turning slightly. The young salesman who had been watching everything, the only one who hadn't dismissed him from the start, now stepped forward hesitantly, his hands gripping the edge of his blazer. I just wanted to say," the salesman stammered, then took a deep breath, straightening his posture. "I apologize for how you were treated. You deserve better than this." A murmur of agreement rippled through the employees. Some nodded, others shifted uncomfortably, now fully aware of the huge mistake their manager had made. Keanu studied the young man for a moment, then gave a slow, understanding nod. "Thank you," he said simply. Then, as he reached for the door handle, a sudden voice, louder, desperate, cut through the room. "Wait!" Richard. His face was flushed, his once confident smirk now completely gone. He took an unsteady step forward, swallowing hard. "Mr. Reeves, I didn't know who you were," he said, his voice a strained mix of panic and regret. "If I had—" Keanu turned fully now, his gaze sharp. "If you had known," he repeated. His voice wasn't raised, but it cut through the room like a blade. Richard flinched. "If you had known who I was, you would have treated me with respect?" Keanu asked. His words were slow, deliberate. "And if I wasn't me, you would have thrown me out anyway?" The weight of the question crushed Richard. Keanu took a step closer. "I don't need an apology, but you do need to ask yourself, who else have you treated this way?" Richard had no answer. Keanu held his gaze for a moment longer, then nodded once. Not with anger, not with forgiveness, but with finality. And then he walked out. The glass doors swung shut behind him, leaving the dealership in complete silence. Richard stood there, breathless, shaken, his entire world crumbling. But the consequences of his actions, they were only just beginning. The silence inside the dealership was suffocating. No one dared to move. No one dared to speak. Keanu Reeves was gone, but the weight of what had just happened still hung in the air like a storm waiting to break. Richard stood stiff, his fists clenched, his breath shallow. His career, his reputation, everything he had built was unraveling. Employees exchanged uneasy glances, customers whispered among themselves, and then, like a spark igniting a wildfire, someone pulled out their phone. Click. A photo of Keanu leaving the dealership. Click. A video replaying the exact moment Richard shoved him. Within minutes, the footage was all over social media. Luxury car dealership manager insults and attacks Keanu Reeves. Keanu Reeves humiliated by arrogant manager, but his response will shock you. The internet exploded. Millions of views, thousands of comments. People from all over the world rushed to Keanu's defense. Who treats Keanu Reeves like this? He's literally one of the kindest people alive. This dealership is done. I would never buy from them. This is exactly what's wrong with society, judging people by their appearance. Richard's phone started buzzing uncontrollably. Calls from upper management, from furious customers, from reporters. The dealership's social media pages were flooded with backlash. Their Google reviews destroyed. Customers demanded refunds. Wealthy clients cancelled their pre-orders. By the next morning, major news outlets picked up the story. The dealership's name was now synonymous with arrogance, discrimination, and failure. And then, the final blow. The dealership released a public statement, calling the incident a misunderstanding. But no one bought it. Hours later, Richard was fired. His reign of power, his status, his entire career, gone in an instant. Meanwhile, Keanu? He never even responded to the controversy. Instead, he quietly walked into a small, family-owned dealership across town. No luxury branding, no overpriced exclusivity, just honest people doing honest business. And there, he found the car he had been looking for. Before leaving, he posed for a simple photo with the dealership staff and posted it with a caption that broke the internet once again: "True luxury is respect." Thank you for reminding me of that. The post went viral, gaining millions of likes, thousands of shares. And just like that, one dealership collapsed while another thrived, because at the end of the day, Keanu didn't need to fight for revenge. The world took care of it for him.